Welcome to our workshop called Community Engagement to Drive Racial Equity. My name is Lyndon, and I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute. My work primarily focuses on using community-centered methods to address housing insecurity and homelessness. I have a background as a social worker, working in direct service with people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity and doing policy and advocacy work related to that. I'm joined today by my colleague, Michaela Tahoe. She is a research analyst at the Urban Institute, and her work really focuses extensively on community engaged projects, including for the federal government and with local housing authorities. So for those of you who don't know, the Urban Institute is a nonprofit research organization based out of Washington, D.C., and our goal is to provide data and evidence to help advance upward mobility and equity. Our work in particular is situated within our Community Engaged Resource Center, a center that provides technical assistance, research, and other tools for communities looking to center directly impacted people in their work. So a little bit about the goals of our workshop today. Wanted to introduce ourselves, spend a little bit of time talking about understanding what community engagement is and racial equity and sort of the relationship between those two things. Do a quick activity around identifying your community and the communities that you're interested in engaging. Speak a little bit about how to understand who you are within your community and positionality, and then talk about what it means to actually do community engaged work and what community engagement looks like in practice. And then our hope is that we have time at the end for a discussion or a Q&A and to learn a little bit more about the work you all do. We thought we were going to have time for introductions, but there are too many people here, so I'm going to skip this slide. Okay, so building off the agenda, we hope by the end of our session today, you feel confident in defining community engagement and really understanding the role of community engaged practices in racial equity. And we hope that we can start to develop what a shared understanding of what we talk about when we talk about community, including who is in the community, as well as you and your organization's position in doing this work. We'll also share some resources at the end from the Urban Institute around doing community engaged work. And before we jump in, I also just want to say that we know that there's already a lot of really important and really great community-centered work going on across communities, including across Wisconsin. This is a very sort of like high-level overview of this type of work. So we also hope to have opportunities to hear more about what you're doing as well. With that, I'm going to pass it to Michaela.
Thanks, Lyndon. Can folks hear me okay in the back? Awesome. Well, welcome all. Thanks for coming to our workshops using community engagement to drive racial equity. I think it's really important that we start with some shared definitions of what we mean by racial equity and community engagement. Racial equity is the process of eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes of everyone, and the intentional and continual practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures by prioritizing measurable change for the lives of people of color. Community engagement and community-engaged research methods, which is what Lyndon and I work in, involves bringing communities into the project or process as intentional contributors and or reviewers of our work. So we think it's really important that we start with this shared definition of what racial equity and community engagement are, because while they are related, they are distinct concepts. That is to say, think of community engagement as tools for driving your racial equity, but it is still possible to work towards racial equity without necessarily having a robust community engagement process. What do we mean by this? Take, for example, that your locality is working on a workforce development investment and being driven by racial equity, you convene historically excluded Black business leaders into a workshop, into hearing what are the challenges of workforce in your community. However, it's not necessarily a robust community-based process if you're not engaging with those who are the most at stake of this investment, such as youth, such as people in poverty, such as the residents and the families within that community. So you could have a racially equitable process and working towards racial equity, but not necessarily being community engaged. On the flip side, let's say you're doing a participatory budgeting process, which if you don't know what that is, we'll actually talk about that in a little bit. But let's say you have this town hall and you do some great outreach and you get 70% engagement from your community, which is exciting, that's awesome. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's racially equitable if the process doesn't proportionally represent residents of color, if there are some voices that are more heard in this space than others. Take, for example, did you engage with the Hmong population? Did you translate your flyers so that people who are non-English speaking are able to engage in this budgeting process? So think of the two as being connected and think of community engagement as an activity as a means of achieving racial equity. So why is it important that we should take a community engaged process to advancing racial equity in our work? We think that programs, services, and policies are better able to address systematic barriers and actually addressing the needs of our communities, especially communities of color, when we are using a community engaged process. We also think incorporating the input of members of communities who've been traditionally underserved, oftentimes communities of color, can also serve as a means of remediating past harms and helping advance racial equity. So if you're doing this joint process of racial equity and community engagement, you're centering the lived experiences of communities of color, and it roots out the structural factors that drive racial inequities. So now that we have a better sense of why community engagement can be a key strategy in driving your racial equity work or your DEI goals, we hope to equip you with some skills and strategies to do community engagement in your work. And I think the first part of that, some of the pre-work you need to do, is understanding who your community is, and then also understanding the identities that you bring to the table and your institution has, and how that is relative to the communities that you're working with. So in this first activity, we'll think through different ways of defining your community. So as we said, before you engage with the community, it's important to understand who the members of your community are. In order to advance community economic development, we need to know who is the community, who are the people that we're trying to reach. There is no one way to identify or define your communities. However, we're providing a framework of 6 topics/identities to help you think through what are potential identities that are important to my community members. I'm not going to go into them in detail just for the sake of time, but if you'll see in your table, there is a worksheet called Defining Your Community, and that goes more into detail of what these identities are, these 6, the demographic, the geographic, the topical, the aspirational, the generative, and the intersecting. And I also want to kind of exemplify what we mean by these different communities. And you'll notice as I'm explaining it, all of our communities differ based on the goals that we have for the project. I'm going to share some examples of the communities that Lyndon and I work with in our projects. So first, Linda and I both work with a project with the DC Housing Authority. We're contracted to help them understand what are the programs and services needed by the residents. And therefore, our community are the folks who live in the DC Housing Authority. They are oftentimes folks who are living in certain parts of DC. That's who our community. There's a geographic component of who our community is. The second example is a project that I work on with the Department of Health and Human Services. We have a National Community Advisory Board, and the HHS hired us to help them understand what folks who are receiving human services programs like TANF, like child care assistance, what are their experiences? So in order to do that, we convened a community of folks who have lived experience of receiving those services. So they have this topical expertise that convenes all of them as our community for this project. And then finally, Lyndon and I also work with a community advisory board that's national, based in New York and Los Angeles, for a larger project about housing justice, where we're getting input on a variety of projects around housing justice and housing in our work. And we've convened our community as folks who are based in New York and Los Angeles, both cities that have a high level of homelessness, and people who have lived experience of housing injustice. So it's intersectional. It's people who are of certain cities who have certain topical expertises. So with that, we're going to spend some time working either individually or in our tables, working through to understanding who our communities are. And I actually just had this conversation with folks from the last session earlier today, and he said that if you're not looking at your communities closely, right, it's so easy to think that your communities are just who you serve, it's just your city, it's just your town, it's just your zip code. But if you're not looking closely at who is in those communities, you'll likely miss who it is that you need to engage with. You'll likely miss those gaps. So we want to take some time for you to brainstorm what are the factors of your community that's important to understand before you engage with them. So, as I said, there are worksheets all around you. There are spaces with questions of the different categories of identities, and we'd like to spend about 10 minutes, either in small groups or individually, starting to fill it out, starting to talk through what are identities or aspects of your community that's important to understand, or that makes them a community. So we'll break off and do that for a few minutes, and then afterwards, we'd love to spend some time hearing from you all about what the process is like, if there's any interesting identities that come up, or if there's any shared or commonalities in the communities that you're working with. So we're gonna break off and do that. And yeah, see y'all in 10 minutes. Okay, I'm going to slowly get us started, but first of all, want to appreciate all of you for engaging in this activity. Y'all jumping right in, asking questions, filling out this worksheet. I really appreciate it. I hope that this is just the start of the conversations that you have with your teams, even with just yourself about who your communities are. So, love it. This is great. I think now I'd love to hear from folks, expanding the discussion to the room, about how this process went. Were there any interesting identities that came out while you were thinking about your communities? Were there any shared identities that you may have with folks at your table, or that your communities may have with your table? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I am Carly Gaines, but here with phenomenal people again, Mike and Annie of UW Health. Mike, huge community that he's involved in. He is the huge the park. What is medical center on the East Park? He is the man that has done it all. And so it has been in the stages since 2018.
Wow.
And it's going to be amazing, different medical practices that are going to be in this building. The Carbon Cancer Center is going to be in this building. So when you're talking about community and new things of research that are going to be in this building, and the community of people, providers, contractors, and the people that are going to come from across the nation to this service is going to be phenomenal. And so when we talk about the community, as Annie works with community partners, and she is in depth in the community of people, and my piece of community, we had I am just sitting with some, I am just so thankful God sent me right here to this table, because I have learned so much. And if you don't get to meet this man, meet him, because, well, he said he's just a facilitator, but trust and believe, you may need the services that's going to be in this building. Mm-hmm. Because when he talked about the new things that are coming down the pike for cancer research and cancer and things and preventative medicine, you're going to say, I met the man. Trust and believe me. His name is Mike.
I'm just the facilitator. Our group is planning, design, and construction. So our community in building this building, it starts with our providers, our board, the inventors, the scientists that make up UW and UW Health. that come up with an idea, and then it has to go through a whole series of community meetings to become then kind of a solidified idea that can become a notion, then can become approved and then funded and then implemented. And so for us on the planning, design, and construction side, our community shifts from the thought leadership that generates that idea to then implementing the project, and the community changes to our stakeholders, which in this case at East Park was Dr. Harari and his wonderful staff at radiation oncology, human oncology at UW. All of those providers and scientists become our community to program the building. We also interact with our stakeholders, which are our patients, which is the community. So we touch Annie and other parts of our organization to bring in past patients, current patients, to inform that process. And then they say, okay, Mike, now you have all this information, go build it. So then our community shifts to the implementers, which are the contractors, the architects, the engineers. I call it a cast of thousands. It's a miracle that the building is built when you consider all the hands that touch it, from the very beginning of thought leadership to the masons on the site laying the brick, to the steel erection, to all of the people that are involved in that. And that's our sense of community. So I'm just a facilitator.
Well, that was awesome. And it sounds like you have this larger community of folks who are just wanting to advance cancer research, folks who care about healthcare and improving the health outcomes of folks in Madison, of sounds like the country altogether. And that's awesome. I think that exemplifies the way community is shifting. It's not just one thing, but it's important to consider, different aspects of it when you're looking at your larger goal or thing that you're working towards. So thank you for that. Thanks for this table. Maybe just for the sake of time, maybe one more group or one more person, if they want to share, reflections from this process, anything interesting that came up.
Hi, not to be beat, but our table was pretty freaking awesome too. So we have health, recruiting, so staffing, as well as property investment on our table. So we talked about some things that, well, we didn't get too far on the activity, not gonna lie, but we discussed, education, technology, health itself, transportation, credit and rent history being kind of pieces that kind of get forgotten, that are often challenges or barriers to even employment, or again, health, or housing, or, so it was just, again, we didn't get too far with the activity, but I think we had a lot of really awesome conversations. So just wanted to share that.
Yay, thank you. And I think y'all are getting at something that's really important also with this activity, not just understanding who your communities are, but understanding how the identities of your community impact your engagement strategies. So as y'all said, identifying your communities helps you identify challenges or barriers to engaging with the community, or how the community engages with your work. So take, for example, if the majority of your residents are a part of a certain city, so using the DC Housing Authority example, let's say most of our residents live in certain parts of DC. Are we taking that in consideration when we're planning our community engagement? Are we meeting them at their community centers, at their places? Likewise, if many of the members of our communities share a demographic identity of being seniors or of having a disability, do we have the infrastructure? Do we have can we make accommodations to make sure that we're fully engaging with them? So it's, again, this activity is important for understanding your communities, but also in understanding how that impacts your work. So with that transitions us very nicely to the second kind of engagement activity or consideration we'd like y'all to think of. So it's important to understand who your communities are, but it's also important to understand your identities and your institution's identities, and how it fits in the context of your larger community and your work. To do this, we'll be talking about positionality and reflexivity. So positionality is all of your identities and experiences combined. It's your gender, your race, your class, your institutions, the folks who work there, and how they intersect with each other, and how that can impact the way you think, the way you approach, the way you process engaging with your communities. And positionality is the process of learning about all of those identities and your social standing, and how that affects your views, your life experience, and ultimately the work that you do. So Why should you understand and state what your positionality is? It helps you be aware of your perspectives, beliefs, and any underlying assumptions or biases you might bring to your work. It also offers transparency about the background, the motivations of your organization, the decision makers, and other key stakeholders. Creating and understanding your positionality statements can also help you advance equity through being transparent about who you are, where you come from, what identities and experiences guide your work, and also what are the gaps or inequities within your identity in comparison with your larger community. And we think that identifying and addressing positionalities are ways that we can interrogate and address the power and the systems of oppression that have led to the inequities that folks experience today. So, with that, there is a second worksheet on your tables. It's called Developing a Positionality Statement Worksheet. We're not going to go through the entire activity just for the sake of time, but hoping that y'all will take this resource and process it, also take it back to your teams. But this worksheet is focused on developing a positionality statement. A positionality statement lays out the important parts of your identity, your institution's identity, how these are perceived by your community, and how it might affect your work. So there are three, we think, components of a positionality statement, and you'll see in the worksheet that there are questions under each of these kind of parts of the positionality statement. First is your identity, such as race, your educational background, and this can also be applied to your institution. Are most of the staff that you work with college educated? Are most of them of a certain race? And then is perception and history of your institution. How is your institution or your field of work or the policy or program that you work on, how is that perceived by your community? Have they interacted with the communities before? What was the reaction like? And then finally, how did these intersecting identities impact your work? If, for example, there are racial or educational differences between your organization and the community you serve, how might that affect the work that you do? So, there, on the worksheet, there is kind of questions regarding each of these components of the positionality statement, 2 examples of positionality statements, and then a space for you to start drafting your own. And before we move on, I think the one final thing I'd like to say about positionality statements is that this is just the start. Even this can be difficult, right? Being introspective, thinking about your identity, thinking about how others identify, thinking about how that might mesh, right? But even after you've done that, the work isn't done. It's not enough to just write a positionality statement and publicize it. It's instead should be a reflective and continual process. This process of addressing and even just wrestling with your own positionality, incongruities between you and the community. It's a continual process that we call reflexivity. So both of which, positionality and reflexivity, are both very important tools for you to interrogate power dynamics, systems of oppression, and hopefully help you move towards racial equity and just equity in your work in general. So with that, as folks are reviewing the worksheets and thinking of your own identities, your positionality, I'm going to pass it off to Lyndon to talk a little bit about what community engagement looks like, as we've mostly been focusing on the pre-work, what you should know before you engage. What does it actually look like when you do engage?
Thanks, Michaela. So as Michaela mentioned, understanding your community and who you want to engage in your community engaged work, as well as identifying who you are in relation to your community, are 2 really important first steps in thoughtfully and meaningfully engaging in community. However, they're not the only first steps. So we want to just quickly highlight a few additional steps that we recommend taking before moving into the actual process of engaging directly with communities. We think that spending time to do this pre-work really will help inform your next steps and can also help you identify and address possible challenges or tensions that perhaps you weren't aware of or that you hadn't thought of that might come up once you start doing this work. So these are included in the Defining the Community worksheet on that back page or top of the other page. And just wanted to go over them quickly to start thinking about these as we move forward. So the first sort of step we recommend is assessing the current level of community engagement or collaboration already going on in your organization. So think through things like, how has your organization engaged or collaborated with the community in the past? How did it go? What went well, and maybe what were some challenges or struggles that you had in doing that work? The second piece of this is inventorying existing partnerships. So thinking through, like, what type of partnerships with the community do you already have or have you had in the past? What is your relationship like with these community partners? And are they the community that you've identified as the community you're hoping to engage? Or is it a separate community that you've been engaging but sort of realizing that it's maybe not the right community for your specific goals? The third, as we just talked about, is consider individual and institutional positionality. So thinking about who is doing this work, what are they bringing to it, and what experiences or identities are influencing the way you're approaching the work. This fourth one is really considering acknowledging and addressing power dynamics between you and the community. And so really starting to think through, where does your organization sit within the community, and what are the power dynamics? Do you hold the purse strings? Are you the one sort of funding community programs? And what does that look like when you're engaging with communities? Or is there tension around, are people going to be transparent or honest with you and share their experiences? And how can you sort of even out the power dynamics in those engagements and in those relationships? And then the last one, we've talked about a little bit already, but reflecting on potential harms or structural inequities that have been perpetuated by policymaking or research in the past. And so we know that there are many communities that have been harmed by policies, institutions, or research in the past. And so before engaging or re-engaging with communities, we recommend you spend some time thinking about how you may be received or perceived when you start to do this work. So I know for myself in research, I work primarily with people directly impacted by homelessness, and there are so many people who are just wary of researchers coming in and taking data from them and just tokenizing them and sort of like asking them for their experiences without anything in return. And so in doing thoughtful community engaged work, really thinking of like, how can I sort of recognize that in these very first conversations before jumping into asking more of people, and how can we sort of give back and collaborate with communities? Okay, so now that we've sort of gone through like all of these recommended steps of like this pre-work before community engagement, I'd love to jump into talking about what community engagement actually looks like. And we see community engagement as a spectrum, and it really depends on sort of your goals, in what form community engagement can take. So here on the left, we have sort of like the like least engaged type of involvement with the community, which is informing, all the way to the right, which is empowering communities. And I sort of like to think of this as on the left, sort of like transactional engagements, all the way to the right, which is transformative engagements. And I'll share a little bit more about what each of these look like. So sort of on the least engaging type of activities is informing communities. So informing communities is really what it sounds like. Telling community members, like perhaps you're conducting a project, here are the results, without really providing an opportunity for them to provide input or feedback prior to finalization. So maybe it's just sharing with the community after you've already published a report. Sort of a little bit more engaged than that, the second piece on the spectrum is consultation. So this is providing an opportunity for communities to provide feedback and input. So to us, this really is like an opportunity to share a draft of a policy or like an outline of a project to community members before moving forward or before publishing. Sometimes we like to refer to this as like gut checking with the community, like going to them once and saying like, does this resonate? Does this seem right? And taking their feedback under consideration before publishing. Sort of right in the middle is involving communities. So this is incorporating community input and needs throughout any sort of engagement process. So this could include listening to community members and incorporating their input and feedback throughout a process. So meeting with communities, whoever you've defined as your community, at multiple times throughout a process. Perhaps you go to them at the beginning of a policy or program redesign and say, this is what we're thinking, what should we definitely include? And then return to them at several points throughout the process to seek feedback and input then that you take into consideration as you develop your program. Further along in the spectrum is collaboration. So this is really partnering together with community in all decisions and solutions. So collaboration really requires, again, sort of like that communities have input into all decisions. So identifying the research questions or identifying the program goals. It could look like an organization approaching a community at the very beginning of a project and saying, can you be involved without? Can we hire you as consultants? Can we be collaborators on this project together? And really making sure that it's meeting the needs of the community throughout the process. And then the last one, again, sort of like the most transformative type of community engagement is empowering communities. So this is really where communities lead the decision-making process. It really shifts power to communities, whoever that is, like people directly impacted by programs or policies or research in our case. So an example of this is like perhaps a community has identified a need that's very specific to them, and they actually come to your organization to support them in achieving a goal. Through an empowering engagement process, the community could lead this process, including developing research questions or disseminating findings with support from your organization, but really letting them take the lead to make sure it meets their unique needs of their community. Okay, great. So building on what I just shared, I wanted to provide some additional examples of what the full spectrum of community engagement looks like. So for example, all the way on the left here, we have informing. So if you're going to open houses, if you're tabling, if you're providing flyers about the work you've done, that is informing the community without sort of providing an opportunity for feedback. And then sort of all the way on the other end in this empowerment type of work, doing things like participatory budgeting, participatory action research, or community-driven planning, where you're engaging the community throughout the entire process, really provides an opportunity, again, to shift power directly back to directly impacted folks, and make sure that whatever we're doing is really actually meeting a need or a goal of the community. Okay. So we don't have time to talk about every example, but we did want to share a few types of community engaged processes that we use in our work. That includes involvement, collaboration, and empowerment. So the first one is what we at the Urban Institute call data walks or data interactives. And these are a way for community stakeholders, so people like residents, researchers, program administrators, local government officials, or service providers to engage in dialogue around relevant data about their community. So what this looks like is bringing data, whatever that is, whether that's the demographics of the community or who uses information about who uses a service, or results of a satisfaction survey, to the community and asking, like, can you help us interpret what we're seeing? Like, to us, this is how we're interpreting this, but is there a reason, like, as a community member, as an expert, a directly impacted person or someone who's used this service, can you help us identify what this data means? In doing this really provides an opportunity to improve your understanding of your data and about hearing directly from communities about how they perceive whatever we've learned. So for example, the Urban Institute recently traveled to rural Mississippi to host a data interactive to discuss wastewater and economic development in the community. And so in doing so, they found a variety of best practices for doing interactives in rural environments, such as working with trusted community partners, establishing local relationships, and making sure that the way we present data is accessible. So another sort of type of community engagement that can be either involving communities or collaborating with communities are community or lived experience advisory boards. So these boards are comprised of community members who share either an identity, an expertise, or another characteristic, and they are convened to contribute community voice to an initiative, program, policy, or project. CABs really provide an essential link between team members who may have like topical expertise or methodological expertise of a particular program or policy, but lack sort of the on-the-ground knowledge or lived experience that can really inform a project or a policy or a research study. And so bless you. So for example, we have here, wanted to share an example of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority's Lived Experience Advisory Board. So LAHSA is the primary sort of homelessness response system out of LA, and they formed a board to contribute to understanding their programs and policies throughout their system. And so this board is comprised of 12 members with lived experiences of homelessness, who people within the Homelessness Service Authority go to sort of share more about their program ideas, to get information and make sure sort of that there is community voice to address their challenges or decisions. And last, which we mentioned a couple times already, is participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting gives an opportunity for community members to provide direct input into what is funded within a community. So folks can submit ideas of things they want funded or vote in the budgeting process. We heard in the earlier session that there's some of this already going on in Wisconsin, so you may have already participated in participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting was first implemented in the 1980s, really with the goal of like taking power from like behind closed doors of who makes decisions about what sort of programs are funded and put them back into the community. So people who are living in the community can say like, this is what's important to me, this is where I want our dollars to go. So this example I have up here is from the 39th district in New York. And so each year council members of each district get sort of a pot of money to do participatory budgeting. And here are some of the things that community members are voting on this year, which I thought was really exciting, including improving high school bathrooms, giving a new cafeteria to a local elementary school, or updating the library. And so I think that this is another way in which if you are sort of at a municipal level, you can engage communities from the very beginning of asking them like, what are their priorities and how should we spend our money? But I also wanted to flag just before I wrap up that I think there is an opportunity for people, maybe not in local government, but who run programs to also participate in things like participatory budgeting. For example, in San Francisco, as part of the Chronic Homelessness Initiative, which was an initiative to have chronic homelessness, they had a community advisory board comprised of people who had experienced homelessness, and they actually gave them an opportunity to decide which programs were funded. So people submitted applications and gave them the power to say, you have the direct lived knowledge and the expertise to know which solutions can help address homelessness in our communities. So again, shifting power back to communities and directly impacted folks to inform services and programs. Okay, I know that was a lot of information. I think we could talk a lot longer, but I will end there for any questions. We have our contact information up here, and if you scan the QR code, we have a list of additional resources through the Urban Institute that can provide some additional context for what we shared here today. Thank you.
Yeah, kind of. We didn't get like 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah. So I have a question. So I do community discourse research, which my little mom but I didn't know that it just when you don't pass it over here at University of in Madison, we have a big university with top. We have tons of researchers. And what's come down the hill for research I do like in I go in the board, I go like that, I go in the work. Well, several of the have will break out for non-migrant. Was we have to make sure that our researchers that you made it.
But you didn't say are first involved in our community. They need to come down the hill, come to church service, come to the Urban League meeting, come to community events to get to know our community before you come to ask us or put up your flyer or how you can how we can help you.
Yes.
And the other piece that I did notice that you may want you to comment on is that if a researcher is going to come into our community, in their budget needs to be a stipend for our community that's going to be meeting with you to help develop your research, right?
Yes.
So I didn't see that, but it's probably there. But I suggest that you put it in there because when you're dealing with community and you're dealing with community participatory research, that is key and important because their time and the homeless, their time is critical and important. And giving them stipends, because you all get billions of dollars off of those grants, that you need to be able to invest back into them and so they can help you develop your program. And now at the back end, after you get done and after it gets all approved, then you make sure that research comes back to the community, that you invest those dollars back in the community, continue to build them up.
Yes. I have nothing to add other than we fully acknowledge all of that. We have whole separate documents and conversations every day, particularly about paying people and compensating people at a rate. Well, so at a rate commensurate with their peers who are maybe not directly impacted folks. The Urban Institute, we have a whole sort of like community engaged compensation guide and identifying like some of the struggles of how do you pay people if you can't directly pay them? Like what does a stipend look like? Giving gift cards to people is not enough. We need to pay people cash when we're engaging folks. So yes, 100%, that wasn't perhaps the goal of today's presentation. And then also really appreciate what you said about being a part of the community and not just coming in and saying, I'm a researcher, I'm a policymaker, I want to work with you. And we hope that some of the things in like the pre-engagement checklist that we did talk about really highlight some of that. But again, like as someone who's in a position of power coming in and saying like, work with me is not enough. You have to build trust, you have to build rapport, and you have to show them like this is a collaborative process. And maybe Michaela has something.
Sorry, we didn't plan how to do this, so sorry, that's a bit awkward. I also, something that you said of like, before folks go down the hill and talk to people and like, ask for information from the community, like spend some time down that hill and talk to people. I offer to you all also thinking about having folks who are down the hill join you up on the hill, right? What is stopping you from hiring community members, joining your team? At the Urban Institute, we have really tried to hire community researchers, people from like the communities that we're doing research on, and having them be, as Lyndon and I are researchers, partners and collaborators and full-on just co-workers in the work that we do. Yeah, so like I hear what you're saying and I fully agree, but I also am encouraging you all to think more than just, how do we spend time with our communities? How do we empower our communities so that they're doing the work? We're not just, being more intentional about our work, but doing it so that we're all doing this work together. So yeah, just wanted to add to that.
So I did that thought too, that you do add that on your design. Yes, my there.
If we had more time, we have so many things to tell y'all.